Okay, so this is my speech for speech class, dual credit speech 101. So this is my audience. Okay, I'm going to begin my speech. So I had you guys take a poll, and I found out that the majority of you, like me, like playing video games. Shocker, I know. I was wondering a couple years ago what goes on behind the scenes when making a video game and a video game distributor. And so I looked into the history of Steam and the Valve Corporation. I've spent a lot of time on this topic, but it's not too complex of a topic. It should be pretty easy to understand, but I'm going to try and go over as much as possible. I'm going to go over the early days and the creation of Valve, the creation of Steam and Valve's distribution of games, and their entrance into the hardware market. To start, let's talk about the beginning of Valve. In 1996, Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington were Microsoft employees, and they wanted to move on to do something bigger and better with their lives. To do this, they decided to quit Microsoft and start working on a video game together. They decided they were going to make this new game, Half-Life, which would be a story-driven first-person shooter, rather than a faster-paced first-person shooter. And so they developed their own engine called Gold Source after running into issues with the Quake engine, and released their game Half-Life in 1998. This game was met with great critical acclaim. A lot of people loved the AI in the game and the way that the game played, and this is what set them off to become a much bigger company in the future. After the success of Half-Life 1, they wanted to get more games in their catalog so that they could make more money. So they started outsourcing their game development to a company called Gearbox Games. Gearbox Games was in charge of creating Half-Life spin-offs and keeping the engine up to date. Some of these games include Half-Life Opposing Force and Blue Shift, and Gearbox was also in charge of porting all of these original Half-Life games to consoles. But at the same time, Gabe Newell started working on Half-Life 2. And while working on Half-Life 2, he needed a way to update and distribute Valve-made games to the population. This was incredibly important for Half-Life 2, as he wanted it to be a saga that you could play back-to-back, and you could all download from the same launcher. And it was also important for the game Counter-Strike, which was a spin-off of Half-Life made by a different development team that was eventually acquired by Valve. To do this, they needed a distributor to make this game widely available, and so they created Steam. So going into the second era of the Valve Corporation, where Steam comes into play. Steam was released in 2003 alongside Half-Life Blue Shift on the computer. This allowed for Valve to patch games and do updates, as well as making online play easier to manage. Steam was pretty small and scrappy at the beginning, but within a couple of months they had already gotten people to come and put games on their launcher, starting with Mafia, which is a game that takes place in the 1930s, where you play as a character like Al Capone. Valve wanted this to be their main income rather than games. So they got to work on really refining it and polishing it. And by the early 2010s, it was refined enough that it was used by the majority of PC gamers to buy and launch their games. While at the same time of doing this, they also had to think about how to expand. And so they started working on their own operating system for a computer that would just play video games, kind of like a console, but with computer parts. And their dream idea was SteamOS. And the way they went about achieving this was they used the Unix Linux operating system base to create a easily modular OS that they could put in Steam. And at this time, they started really working on making as many games on Steam compatible with other platforms like Linux, Unix, and Mac OS, so that it would be easier to port everything to their OS. And from there starts the final era of the Valve Corporation, their entrance into the hardware market. They released SteamOS as a beta in 2012, and by 2014, they had already found partners to work with them to make what they called the Steam Machine. The Steam Machine was a small form factor console that would run SteamOS, but it was not produced by Valve itself. It was produced by partners like Alienware and MSI, who would make their Steam boxes and Steam machines available to the market. This was a idea that first started propping up in like 2013, and by the time that the majority of them were released in 2015 and 2016, they were hitting backlash because of the fact that they were only as powerful as a console and had less compatibility because of the limited operating system, because it was based on Linux and just didn't have as much support as Windows. Learning from this mistake, they went and instead of making their own machines, they decided to go with add-ons and things that there's already a market for. So they decided to go into VR, and with their introduction into VR, they bought Index and released the Valve Index VR headset. This is widely known as the best of the VR headsets, and it came with a hefty price of almost $1,500 for a headset and controllers. Valve did not sell many of them, but the Valve Indexes that they did sell are widely known as some of the best VR headsets in the game. However, even with these two cheaper, inexpensive computer and the headset game pointed more towards enthusiasts, they wanted to find a middle ground. So in 2020, they announced that they were going to make a handheld console. This was a departure from what they were used to. They had made controllers in the past, they'd made partnered with computer manufacturers in the past, but they'd never made a full-on console. And so they set to work making it as modular and easy to repair as possible, while still fitting it into a small form factor. Many people have compared it to the Nintendo Switch in size, and it has about a 7-inch screen if you look at it, so it's not huge, but it does have quite a bit of power backing it up with new computer parts and everything. The Valve Index was more expensive and more impressive, but the Steam Deck, as they called their new handheld console, proved to be more capable at games than any of the other products they had put out in the past, and they made it more accessible to both lower-end income individuals and higher-end income individuals, with a $350 model and up to a $700 model. This Steam Deck, released in 2021, was their first introduction into their own made hardware that ran games natively. And it was really a departure from what they had done in the past. And that brings us up to date. So in my opinion, I know it's difficult to say in your opinion in an informational speech, but in my opinion, Steam has been very important to the industry as a whole. They really pushed the idea of online game distribution, and they've had effects on other markets like consoles, who Valve set the standard for the amount of money to take from a developer when releasing a game. They set the standard at about 30%, and that's what even people like Apple and Google do on their Play stores. Similarly, they set a standard for other groups like Xbox and PlayStation on how to integrate third-party support for games. In conclusion, I think that we can all learn something from the Valve Corporation and Steam as a whole, and it affects the way that we play video games and the way that we do anything electronically now. Thank you. And thank you guys for watching my speech.